There is an unwritten rulebook for war. And rule number one of air combat is that a trained pilot and his aircraft are a priceless, reusable asset. But in 1944, off the coast of the Philippines, the Japanese took that rulebook and set it on fire. They began trading one rookie pilot and one aging plane for an American warship. On paper, it was the most illogical, inefficient tactic imaginable. And it created a terrifying mystery that haunted Allied command until the final day of the war. How do you fight an enemy who has turned his own death into a weapon? Sound of a gentle sea, distant hum of an aircraft engine, then silence. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the sun, not a gentle sun, but the hard, equatorial glare of the Philippine Sea in late October 1944. It beats down on the steel deck of the escort carrier USS St. Louis, making the air shimmer and the ocean a blinding sheet of silver. The smell is a cocktail of salt, diesel fumes, and the lingering metallic scent of gunpowder from the morning's action. For the men of Task Unit April 3rd, 77 callsign Taffy 3, the day had already been a brutal education in the chaos of naval warfare. They were a small fleet of slow, thin-skinned escort carriers and destroyers, never meant to fight a fleet action. They were the support troops, the logistical backbone. But this morning, off the coast of Samar, they had stumbled into the path of the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left, a behemoth of battleships and cruisers. It was a fight between wolves and sheepdogs, and by some miracle of courage and desperation, the sheepdogs were, for the moment, still alive. A sense of ragged, disbelieving relief is just beginning to settle over the St. Louis. The Japanese battleships are pulling away, vanishing over the horizon. Now, the new threat is from the sky. On the bridge, lookouts scan the hazy dome of blue, their eyes raw and burning. Every speck, every cloud, could be death. Imagine you are one of those men. A 19-year-old signalman from Ohio. The adrenaline from the surface battle is starting to wear off, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. Your job is simple: watch the sky. Report what you see. The general quarters alarm has been screaming for what feels like an eternity. Below you, on the flight deck, crews are frantically trying to patch holes and refuel the few planes that survived the morning's slaughter. It's a scene of controlled, exhausted chaos. Then, a call comes from the portside lookout. Bogey, bearing 280, Angels 15. Another one. Just another Japanese plane, another pilot coming to pay his respects. You raise your binoculars, your knuckles white. You see it. A single Mitsubishi A6M0, the iconic fighter of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It's coming in fast, but something is wrong. It feels different. Veterans of the Pacific War had developed an instinct for this, a feel for the rhythm of an air attack. A normal pilot, facing the wall of anti-aircraft fire now erupting from the American fleet, would jink and weave. He'd be a predator, trying to line up a shot, drop his bomb, and then use his skill to escape the claws of the flak. Survival is the first rule of being a pilot. You have to live to fly the next mission. But this pilot, he isn't weaving. He's flying straight. Not just straight, but with a terrifying, almost serene stability. The air around his plane is shredded by explosions from the 5-inch guns, a hornet's nest of steel, but he doesn't deviate. He flies through it as if it isn't there. On the bridge, the captain is screaming orders. Hard to port. All guns, concentrate fire on that bandit. The ship begins to heel over, a wounded animal trying to present a smaller target. But the Zero adjusts its course with a cold, terrifying precision. It's not aiming for a point near the ship. It's not trying to drop a bomb. The men in the gun tubs can see the pilot in his cockpit now, a tiny, determined figure. And in that moment, the horrifying truth dawns on hundreds of men simultaneously. This isn't an attack. It's a ritual, a prayer aimed at the heart of the ship. The plane is the weapon. The Zero dives. It seems to float for an impossible second, then slams into the flight deck of the St. Louis. The impact itself is a sickening crunch of metal on metal. But then, a heartbeat later, its 550-pound bomb cooks off. A column of fire and black smoke erupts from the carrier's guts, ripping through the hangar deck, where planes are being refueled and rearmed. A chain reaction of secondary explosions tears the little ship apart from the inside. 30 minutes later, the USS St. Louis slips beneath the waves, taking 114 of her crew with her. Aboard the other ships of Taffy 3, sailors watch in stunned silence. They have just witnessed something that has no place in their manuals, no entry in the rulebook of war they had been taught to memorize. They had just seen a man, a trained and valuable pilot, turn his own body and his advanced aircraft into a guided missile. It was an act that defied every law of military logic, an act of such profound and alien fanaticism that it felt like it came from another reality. In that single, horrific moment, the war had changed. And for the intelligence officers back at Pearl Harbor, who would soon receive the frantic, garbled after-action reports, the sinking of the St. Lo wasn't just a tragedy. It was a terrifying anomaly, an impossible data point. It raised a question that would haunt the final, bloody year of the war, a question that cut to the very heart of their enemy's soul. What in God's name were they fighting? Sound of a clattering teletype machine, a quiet, sterile room, a single man clearing his throat now. Travel with me. Leave the fire and the drowning men in the Philippine Sea and move 4,000 miles east to the nerve center of the Pacific War. We're in a quiet, climate-controlled room deep within the SINCPAC headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The air is thick with stale coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights. Here, war is not a visceral thing of blood and steel, it's an abstract science of logistics, intelligence, and probabilities. It's a vast, intricate chess game played across 1 million square miles of ocean on colossal maps studded with pins and celluloid markers. The men here are the high priests of that science. They deal in facts, in enemy fleet compositions, in fuel consumption rates, and aircraft production numbers. Their entire world is built on the predictable, rational behavior of a military machine. The first reports about the St. Lo arrive here not as a scream of terror, but as a dry, staccato burst from a teletype machine. An intelligence officer, a commander with thinning hair and tired eyes, reads the initial signal. Escort carrier St. Lo hit by enemy aircraft. On fire. Sinking. His first reaction is professional, detached. He logs the loss. Tragic, but an expected cost of doing business in a major naval engagement. Then comes the addendum. A detail from the preliminary after-action report: aircraft appeared to be deliberate crash. The commander leans back in his chair. He's seen this before, or thinks he has. It's filed away under a known category. In the unforgiving calculus of air combat, sometimes a pilot, his plane shot to ribbons, his controls gone, makes a final, desperate lunge at the nearest target. It's the last act of a dying man. It's not a tactic, it's a tragedy. A moment of individual, spontaneous fanaticism. This was the official explanation, the comforting one. It fit neatly into the existing psychological profile of the Japanese soldier, fanatically brave, loyal to the emperor, willing to die rather than surrender. But it was still framed within the logical rules of war. You use your weapon, the bomb, the torpedo, to inflict maximum damage. The pilot and his aircraft are a valuable asset, to be preserved if possible. Wasting both on a single attack is, from a strategic perspective, horrifically inefficient. The initial assessment in Pearl Harbor was simple: these were isolated incidents, the death throes of a defeated air force. They were a bug in the enemy's system, not a terrifying new feature. But then, the blizzard of frantic signals from Taffy 3 refused to stop. The teletype machine kept chattering, a ghost haunting the quiet intelligence room. Another carrier, the USS Kalinin Bay, reports a deliberate crash on her flight deck. Then another, the USS Kitkun Bay, and the Santee, the Sewanee. The reports are confused, chaotic, filled with the raw shock of the men witnessing them. But one word keeps appearing, over and over, like a drumbeat of a new and terrible reality: deliberate. Intentional. He never wavered. He was aiming for the bridge. Imagine the commander in that quiet room. He's staring at the map, at the neat little markers representing the ships of Taffy 3. The official story, the one that makes sense, is that a handful of pilots got unlucky and decided to go out in a blaze of glory. But the data points on the teletype paper in his hand are telling him something else. This isn't a series of isolated incidents. It's a pattern. 5, 6, 10 attacks in a coordinated wave, all using the exact same impossible method. This isn't the work of individual dying men. This is organized. This is planned. This is a doctrine. Imagine spending your entire life learning the rules of chess, mastering every opening, every defense, only to watch your opponent, in the middle of a match, suddenly pick up his queen and hurl it at your king, sacrificing his most powerful piece for a single, bloody, and shockingly effective strike. The game you thought you were playing is over. A new, far more terrifying one has just begun. The reports from the fleet, from the exhausted and traumatized survivors, were no longer just data. They were confirmation. The comfortable, logical explanation of battlefield desperation evaporated under the sheer, horrifying weight of the evidence. The plan on the map had just been declared war on by a reality it could no longer comprehend. And the first, terrifying question was no longer what happened, but why. Sound of a projector clicking through slides, a low murmur of concerned voices in a briefing room to understand the sheer panic this new weapon induced in Allied high command. You have to understand the brutal mathematics of the Pacific War in late 1944. The American war machine was an industrial titan, a behemoth of production. For every one plane Japan could build, the United States was building 10. For every ton of steel Japan could forge, America produced 50. The war, from the cold, clear perspective of a planner in Washington, had already been won. It was a simple, irreversible equation. All that remained was the grim task of closing the distance, island by bloody island, until the final invasion of the Japanese homeland. The core of this strategy, the absolute linchpin of the entire Pacific campaign, was the aircraft carrier. Let's use an analogy. Think of the American push across the Pacific as a massive, complex construction project. The goal is to build a bridge all the way to Tokyo. The Seabees and the Marines are the workers, building the foundations on islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. But the aircraft carriers? They are the mobile power stations. They are the floating factories that produce the one tool that makes the entire project possible: air superiority. Without control of the sky, you cannot move ships, you cannot land troops, you cannot supply an army. The carrier was the queen on the chessboard, the one piece that projected American power across thousands of miles of empty ocean. And that is why the reports from the Philippines were not just alarming, they were existentially terrifying. The Kamikaze, this divine wind, was a weapon that, for the first time, seemed purpose-built to defy American industrial supremacy. You see, the entire defensive system of a U.S. Navy carrier group was designed to fight a conventional air attack. It was a layered defense, like the rings of a fortress. Far out, you had your own fighter planes, the Hellcats and Corsairs, acting as a combat air patrol to intercept enemy bombers. Closer in, you had a screen of destroyers and cruisers, a picket line designed to throw up a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. And finally, on the carrier itself, you had a bristling array of Bofors and Oerlikon cannons, a last-ditch wall of steel. This system was designed to stop a pilot who wanted to live. It was based on the assumption that an attacker would try to evade, that he would be forced to break off his attack if the fire was too intense. But the Kamikaze pilot, he wasn't playing by those rules. He had weaponized his own death. He could fly through a storm of flak that would make a conventional pilot turn back, because turning back was not an option. He only had to be accurate for a single, final second. And worse, he was a thinking missile. He could adjust for the ship's evasive maneuvers. He could see a gap in the defenses. He could aim for the most vulnerable points: the elevator, the bridge, the bomb storage. The strategic danger was profound. A single, aging Zero, flown by a pilot with maybe 100 hours of training, could, with one successful strike, mission kill a billion-dollar aircraft carrier and take 1,000 skilled men out of the war. Suddenly, the American advantage in numbers felt terrifyingly fragile. They could build 100 carriers, but what good were they if the Japanese could trade one obsolete plane and one rookie pilot for one of them? The economic equation, the one that guaranteed an American victory, had been flipped on its head. This wasn't just a new tactic, it was a form of strategic jujitsu, using America's own size and the value of its assets against it. A clock had started ticking in the halls of Sinkpak. The next major objective was Iwo Jima. After that, Okinawa. And then, the home islands themselves. Each step would bring the fleet closer to a swarm of Japanese air bases. What they had seen at Leyte Gulf was just a preview, a handful of planes. What would happen when the enemy unleashed hundreds, or even thousands, of these suicide attackers against the invasion fleet? The vision was apocalyptic, a sky black with zeros, each one a guided bomb aimed at the heart of the American fleet. The bridge to Japan, so carefully constructed, could be shattered. And so, the investigation began. It was no longer a matter of simple analysis. It was a desperate, urgent mission declared in the quiet, panicked rooms of Pearl Harbor. They had to get inside the enemy's head. They had to understand the philosophy, the industry, and the desperation that could create such a weapon. They weren't just fighting a military anymore. They were fighting a ghost on the radio, a martyr in the cockpit, a fatal assumption that had been burned into the soul of an entire nation. They had to find the source of the divine wind before it blew them all away. Sound of wind whistling through a bamboo hut, paper rustling, the scratch of a pen. The hunt for the Kamikaze's origin didn't begin in the sterile intelligence rooms of Pearl Harbor. It began months earlier, unknowingly, in the humid, malarial heat of a captured Japanese airfield on the island of Saipan. Summer, 1944. The island had been a fortress, a bloody, month-long meat grinder that had cost the Marines thousands of casualties. In the aftermath, as cleanup crews bulldozed shattered bunkers and buried the dead, a new kind of soldier moved in: the men of the U.S. Navy's Technical Air Intelligence Unit. These weren't frontline infantrymen, they were engineers, academics, and linguists. Their job was to sift through the wreckage of the defeated Japanese garrisons, looking for clues. They were battlefield detectives, piecing together a mosaic of the enemy's mind from the debris he left behind. They were looking for technical manuals, codebooks, anything that could give them an edge. But mostly, they found nothing. The Japanese were meticulous about destroying sensitive materials. Yet, buried in the rubble of a command post, a young ensign, a former literature student from Yale, found something that wasn't a military document. It was a stack of personal diaries. Flimsy, rice paper notebooks filled with elegant, flowing script. Most were mundane, filled with notes on rations, letters home, disconnected thoughts. But one belonged to a Japanese pilot. This diary was the first clue. At first, it seemed like any soldier's journal. He wrote about the heat, the bad food, the loneliness. He sketched pictures of his family back in Kyushu. But as the American linguists began their careful, painstaking translation, a strange, almost poetic fatalism began to emerge. The pilot wasn't writing about victory. He wasn't boasting of his prowess or the emperor's divine destiny. He was writing about the beauty of the cherry blossom. Now, to a Western mind, this seems irrelevant, almost nonsensical. But to the translator, who had studied Japanese culture, it was a thunderclap. He understood the symbolism. The sakura, the cherry blossom, is the ultimate symbol of mono no aware, a gentle, poignant sadness at the transience of life. A cherry blossom is considered beautiful not just for its form, but because its life is so short. It blooms in a riot of color for a few perfect days, and then it is gone, scattered by the wind. Its beauty is inseparable from its death. The pilot wrote, "We are the blossoms of the same tree. We will fall for the emperor, and our petals will enrich the soil of the nation." This wasn't the diary of a man hoping to survive the war. This was the diary of a man who had already accepted his own death as a beautiful, necessary, and noble act. He didn't see himself as a soldier fighting for victory. He saw himself as a petal destined to fall. Here, for the first time, was a flicker of the mindset that could lead a man to fly his plane into a ship. It was a clue not found in a technical manual, but in poetry. It suggested the kamikaze wasn't just a military tactic, it was the violent expression of a deeply ingrained cultural philosophy. This discovery was a spark of light, a feeling of hope in the investigation. The analysts in Pearl Harbor, now armed with this and other translated documents, began to build a new psychological profile of the enemy. The kamikaze wasn't a sudden invention. It was the culmination of something that had been growing in the dark heart of Japanese militarism for years. They felt they were on the verge of a breakthrough, that they were finally beginning to understand the why. They started to believe that if they could just understand this philosophy, this Bushido code they'd heard so much about, they could predict the enemy's next move. They could anticipate the attacks, counter them, and defeat the idea itself. For a brief, optimistic moment, it felt like the mystery was being unlocked. The ghost in the cockpit was being given a name, a face, and a philosophy. It felt like the problem, as horrifying as it was, could be contained within the neat box of cultural analysis. The investigators felt they had found the key. What they didn't yet realize was that the diary they held in their hands wasn't the key to a lock. It was the first page of a book far darker and more complex than they could possibly imagine. And the next chapter was about to be written in fire and blood. Sound of a crackling radio transmission, faint and distorted, with the scream of a diving plane underneath. The optimism in Pearl Harbor, born from the discovery of the pilot's diary, was a fragile thing. The analysts had built a beautiful, coherent theory. The Kamikaze was the ultimate expression of the Bushido Code, a spiritual act of self-sacrifice rooted in the ancient samurai tradition. It was poetic. It was philosophical. It was also, as they were about to discover, dangerously incomplete. Their theory, so neat on paper, shattered against the brutal reality of what was happening in the skies over the Philippines. The divine wind, they had assumed, would be a weapon of last resort, an act of final, defiant beauty. They were wrong. It was becoming a brutally efficient, systematically applied weapon of war. The first blow to their theory was the sheer scale of the attacks. Following the initial wave at Leyte Gulf, the Kamikaze strikes didn't stop. They intensified. Day after day, American ships reported suicide attacks. The pilots weren't just the remnants of a defeated Air Force. Intelligence intercepts began picking up chatter about newly formed units, with names that sent a chill down the spine of every translator. The Shikishima unit, the Yamato unit, the Asahi unit. These weren't random call signs. They were lines from a famous 18th century poem about the spirit of Japan. If someone asks about the Yamato spirit of old Japan, say it is the scent of the mountain cherry blossom in the morning sun. The poetry from the diary was no longer a private reflection. It had been weaponized. It was being used to form entire squadrons whose sole purpose was to die. The second blow was the enemy's chillingly logical adaptation. The initial attacks had been driven by a raw, almost suicidal courage. But now, the Kamikaze pilots were getting smarter. They were becoming cunning tacticians. American radar operators began noticing new patterns. The Japanese planes weren't coming in high and obvious anymore. They were using a tactic the pilots called the anthill. A large group of conventional bombers and fighters would appear on the radar, drawing the American combat air patrol high into the sky. Then, just as the dogfight began, a handful of Zeros would emerge from the chaos, streaking in low over the waves, under the radar, their engines screaming as they aimed for the exposed carriers. They were using conventional forces as a screen, a feint, to allow the suicide attackers to get through. This wasn't the act of a poet seeking a beautiful death. This was the cold, calculated methodology of a killer. This was a thinking, learning enemy. The beautiful theory about the cherry blossom wilted under the heat of this new reality. The Kamikaze wasn't just a spiritual act, it was a horrifyingly rational response to an impossible strategic problem. Japan couldn't compete with American industrial might plane for plane, so they had changed the rules of the game. They had turned their pilots from swordsmen into poison-tipped arrows. The goal was no longer to win the duel, but to ensure the enemy died with you. Imagine being an intelligence officer at SINCPAC, watching this unfold. Your entire framework for understanding the enemy has just been proven fatally naive. The diary from Saipan hadn't been a Rosetta Stone, it was a piece of brilliantly effective propaganda. It was the story the Japanese military wanted their pilots and their enemies to believe. The reality was far more pragmatic and far more terrifying. They weren't just fighting a cult of death. They were fighting an enemy who had looked at the grim arithmetic of their inevitable defeat and had found a way to make the cost of victory so horrifically high that the Americans might simply give up. The investigation was plunged back into darkness, but a deeper, more informed darkness than before. The easy answer: it's their fanatical culture had been exposed as a dangerous oversimplification. The investigators realized they weren't the hunters, methodically tracking a known quarry. They were the ones being hunted, reacting to an enemy who was constantly evolving, constantly refining a tactic that had no counter. They had mistaken the enemy's poetry for his battle plan, and the price of that mistake was being paid in burning ships and dead sailors across the Pacific. The real question was no longer just about the pilot's soul. It was now about the cold, brilliant, and utterly ruthless mind that had conceived of this strategy in the first place. Sound of a submarine's sonar ping, slow and steady. Then the faint, muffled sound of an underwater explosion just as the investigation seemed to hit a wall. just as the Kamikaze threatened to become an unsolvable, terrifying enigma. The breakthrough came. And it came, as they so often do in war, not from a high-level command center, but from the cold, cramped belly of a submarine prowling the dark waters of the South China Sea. The submarine was the USS Stingray. Her mission was simple and deadly: to hunt down and sink what was left of the Japanese merchant marine, to starve the enemy's war machine of oil and rubber. In early 1945, while patrolling off the coast of Formosa, her lookouts spotted a target. Not a tanker, not a troop transport, but a small, unmarked passenger cargo ship, steaming alone. By the rules of engagement, it was a legitimate target. The Stingray's commander gave the order. A spread of torpedoes hissed from their tubes. 2 of them found their mark, and the little ship went down in less than 10 minutes. It was a routine sinking, one of hundreds that month. But a few hours later, the Stingray's sonar operator picked up a strange sound: men shouting in the water. Survivors. Against protocol, but moved by a sense of naval chivalry, the submarine's captain decided to surface and investigate. They found a handful of men clinging to debris, a mix of merchant sailors and army personnel. They were pulled aboard, shivering and exhausted, becoming prisoners of war. It was a minor act of mercy in a brutal conflict. But among those survivors was a corporal, a mechanic, whose testimony would become emblematic of the truths gleaned from dozens of similar interrogations. He was terrified, demoralized, and convinced he was going to be tortured and executed. Back at Pearl Harbor, he was turned over to the interrogators of the Allied translator and interpreter section. These were the real unsung heroes of the intelligence war: Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. They spoke the language flawlessly, they understood the culture, and they were masters of a gentle, psychological approach to interrogation. The Nisei interrogator assigned to the mechanic didn't use threats. He offered him a cigarette, a warm meal, a clean uniform. He spoke to him not as a prisoner, but as a fellow human being, using the familiar dialects of the man's home prefecture. Over several days, the mechanic's terror slowly gave way to a weary relief. He began to talk, and what he revealed, when pieced together with other fragments of intelligence, was a bombshell. He had been stationed at an airfield in the Philippines. Not just any airfield, but a training base for the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the special attack units. The Kamikaze. For the first time, the Americans were getting a look behind the curtain. The mechanic described the process, not as the glorious, ritualistic ceremony the propaganda suggested, but as a grim, almost industrial production line of death. He talked about the planes they used. They weren't the latest models. They were often aging Zeros, obsolete trainers, planes that had been patched up and pulled from boneyards. Their landing gear was sometimes fixed in place, unable to retract, because they were never intended to land again. Their instruments were stripped down to the bare minimum. They were single-use weapons, designed for a one-way trip. But the most chilling revelation was about the pilots themselves. The mechanic explained that they weren't all the grizzled, veteran samurai warriors the Americans had imagined. Many of them were boys, university students, barely out of their teens, who had been drafted, given 100 hours of rudimentary flight training, just enough to take off and fly straight, and then volunteered for the special attack units. He described the ceremonies before a mission: the white headbands, the ritual sip of sake. But he also described the fear in the young pilots' eyes. He talked about how some of them would tremble so badly they couldn't climb into the cockpit without help. He remembered one young pilot, a student of French literature, who spent his last night on Earth quietly reciting poetry by Baudelaire. This was the breakthrough. The ghost on the radio now had a face, and it wasn't the face of a mythical warrior. It was the face of a terrified, indoctrinated teenager. The Kamikaze program wasn't a spontaneous eruption of national spirit. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply cynical strategy conceived by a desperate high command. They were deliberately sacrificing the best and brightest of Japan's next generation, not in a glorious charge, but by strapping them into flying coffins. The information from this one, unheralded army corporal, plucked from the sea by chance, had just given the American investigators a new, terrifyingly clear path forward. The mystery wasn't just about the pilot's soul anymore, it was about the soullessness of the men who were sending him to his death. Sound of a single, heavy file being dropped onto a polished wooden table. A long silence. The debriefing of the mechanic was a seismic event within the intelligence community at Pearl Harbor. Testimony, cross-referenced with new signals intelligence and captured documents, began to form a picture that was not just strategically alarming, but morally repugnant. The investigators, led by a brilliant and methodical Navy captain named Edwin Layton, finally pieced together the uncomfortable truth. It was a truth that didn't fit the heroic narrative of war that America was telling itself. It was messy, cynical, and it implicated their own strategic assumptions in the creation of the monster they now faced. Here is the truth they uncovered. The Kamikaze program was not born in a moment of spiritual epiphany. It was born of sheer, abject military desperation. The architect of the strategy was Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. And Onishi wasn't a wild-eyed fanatic, he was a pragmatist, a naval aviator who had watched Japan's elite pilot corps, the men he had trained and led, be systematically annihilated over the preceding 2 years. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle the Americans nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was the final nail in the coffin. In that one battle, Japan lost over 600 aircraft and nearly all of its experienced carrier pilots. It was a catastrophe from which their naval air arm would never recover. Onishi looked at the ledger of war and saw a brutal, undeniable equation. Japan no longer had the skilled pilots, the advanced aircraft, or the fuel to fight a conventional air war against the United States. It was like a world-class fencing master who had lost his prized rapier and was now armed with a broken stick, facing an opponent with a machine gun. Any attempt to fight by the old rules was suicide. So, he reasoned, if suicide was inevitable, why not make it tactical? Why not turn the act of dying into a weapon? This was the uncomfortable truth. The kamikaze was a deeply logical, if horrifying, response to overwhelming American industrial and military superiority. Onishi had realized that a rookie pilot with 100 hours of training had almost a 0% chance of surviving a dogfight with a 2,000-hour American ace in a Hellcat. He also had a very low probability of successfully dropping a bomb on an evading, heavily defended warship. But, Onishi calculated, if that same rookie pilot's only job was to crash his plane into a target the size of an aircraft carrier, his chances of success rose dramatically. He was trading a life that was almost certain to be lost anyway for the chance to inflict disproportionate damage. It was a ghastly form of cost-benefit analysis. But the most damning part of this new intelligence picture was the revelation of who was being sacrificed. The first wave of kamikaze pilots at Leyte were, in fact, skilled volunteers, men who knew the odds and chose their fate. But as the program expanded, as the demand for bodies grew, the high command began to prey on the young, the idealistic, the impressionable. They were university students, boys who had been studying law, literature, and science, who were pulled from their classrooms and put into cockpits. Their final letters home, many of which were later recovered, were not the rantings of fanatics. They were filled with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. They wrote of duty to the emperor, yes, but they also wrote about their regret at never being able to marry, of their love for their mothers, of their fear of death. This was the truth that the intelligence officers now had to present to the admirals. The enemy they were facing was not a monolith of emperor-worshipping samurai. It was a desperate, dying empire, led by a cabal of ruthless military men who had resorted to the most cynical tactic imaginable. They were feeding their own children into the furnace of war, dressed up in the romantic trappings of Bushido and cherry blossoms, to buy themselves a few more months of time. The kamikaze wasn't a sign of Japan's unyielding spirit. It was the ultimate proof that Japan had already lost. Sound of a heavy leather chair creaking, the rustle of papers, a low, authoritative voice. The report landed on the desk of Admiral Spruance's chief of staff with the force of a dud bomb, a heavy, awkward thud that promised a devastating explosion that never quite came. The atmosphere in the briefing room was thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of an air conditioner fighting a losing battle with the Hawaiian heat. Captain Layton stood before the map of the Western Pacific, a pointer in his hand, his face grim. He and his team had laid it all out: the cynical pragmatism of Onishi, the industrial-scale sacrifice of young, undertrained pilots, the use of obsolete aircraft. His conclusion was stark and unavoidable. "Gentlemen," Layton said, his voice steady, The kamikaze is not a sign of inscrutable fanaticism. It is a symptom of catastrophic military failure. It is the desperate gambit of an enemy whose war machine is completely and irrevocably broken. The divine wind is, in reality, a dying gasp. You would think this revelation would be met with a sense of grim satisfaction, a confirmation that the Allied strategy was working. But the reaction from the Admiral's chief of staff, a stern, by-the-book officer, was one of cold skepticism. He leaned back in his leather chair, a plume of smoke obscuring his face for a moment. A dying gasp, Captain? The reports from Leyte didn't read like a dying gasp. They read like a new and very effective form of naval warfare. Effective in a tactical sense. Yes, sir, Leighton countered, tapping the pointer on Kyushu. But strategically, it's an admission of total defeat. They're resorting to this because they have nothing left. No experienced pilots, no competitive aircraft. Our analysis of their training programs, based on the new POW debriefings, shows they are rushing students into the cockpit with less than 100 hours of flight time. They're not being trained to fight. They're being trained to die. The chief of staff waved a dismissive hand. Their training regimen is their business. Our business is anticipating their capabilities. For years, we've built a narrative for the American public and for our own sailors of an enemy who is fanatically devoted, who will fight to the last man. This fits that narrative perfectly. With respect, sir, that's the problem, Leighton pressed, his voice rising slightly. It fits the narrative too perfectly. The cherry blossom and Bushido elements are propaganda, a romantic gloss on a deeply cynical strategy. They are sacrificing their own children because they have no other move to make. This isn't a sign of their spiritual strength. It's a sign of their material bankruptcy. He took a deep breath, choosing his next words carefully. This changes our own strategic calculus. If we understand this is a weapon of desperation, not some mythical warrior creed, we can better predict its use and scale. For the Okinawa campaign, we must assume they will throw everything they have left into this. Not dozens of planes, but hundreds, perhaps thousands. They will try to overwhelm our defenses through sheer mass, trading bodies for ships. The room was silent. The weight of Leighton's prediction hung in the air. The chief of staff finally broke the silence, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Your analysis, Captain, is based on the testimony of a few demoralized prisoners and your interpretation of their poetry. Our strategy for Okinawa is based on hard numbers, the strength of our combat air patrol, the density of our anti-aircraft screen. Our plan is sound. We will not alter our operational posture based on psychological speculation. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Continue your tactical analysis. Predict their attack vectors, identify their staging airfields. But the why is irrelevant. Our job is to sink their ships and shoot down their planes, not to psychoanalyze their motives. The official story remains the same: we face a fanatical, inhuman enemy. It keeps things simple. It keeps morale high. Your report will be classified at the highest level. That will be all. Leighton felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had done his job. He had descended into the fog of war and returned with a clear, coherent picture of the enemy. But that picture was now being locked away in a safe, deemed too dangerous for widespread consumption. The great machinery of the invasion of Okinawa was already in motion, an unstoppable force. And it was now set on a collision course with a reality that its leaders understood, but refused to fully acknowledge. He had seen the iceberg, but the captain had just ordered full steam ahead. Sound of a ship's alarm, general quarters distant and continuous, overlaid with the roar of aircraft engines and the percussive crump of anti-aircraft guns. This is the lowest point of our investigation. The moment where truth is silenced, where knowledge fails to translate into wisdom. The files are locked away. The warnings are muted. And the fleet, the magnificent, unstoppable armada assembled for the invasion of Okinawa, sails toward its destiny. It is April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The greatest naval force in human history has gathered off the coast of this small, rugged island, the last stepping stone to Japan. Over 1,500 ships, nearly 500,000 men. From the bridges of the flagships, it must have looked like the very definition of invincible power. But the men who had written the secret reports, the intelligence officers like Captain Leighton, watched this display of might with a knot of cold dread in their stomachs. They knew what was coming. They had predicted it. They had mapped the airfields on Kyushu and Formosa. They had estimated the number of planes, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands that had been hoarded and converted for one single, apocalyptic purpose. They had warned that the enemy, knowing this was the final battle, would unleash the divine wind on a scale that would make Leyte Gulf look like a skirmish. Their warnings were logged, filed, and ultimately, fatally underestimated. The High Command, still clinging to its strategic optimism and the comforting narrative of an enemy on the brink of collapse, had made a catastrophic assumption. They believed that the sheer weight of their anti-aircraft defenses, the overwhelming number of their fighter patrols, could absorb the blow. The plan on paper, the beautiful, logical plan, showed a defensive screen that was impenetrable. On April 6th, the plan on paper was set on fire. The Japanese unleashed the first of the great Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum, attacks. It was not a raid. It was a biblical swarm. Nearly 700 aircraft, almost half of them kamikazes, rose from their bases and fell upon the American fleet. Imagine the sky, not as a blue expanse, but as a three-dimensional canvas of horror. High above, American Hellcats and Corsairs tear into the conventional Japanese escorts, a swirling, chaotic dogfight that fills the air with tracer fire and blossoming parachutes. But below them, slipping through the gaps, come the suicide planes. They come in waves, from all directions, at all altitudes. Zeros, Vals, Judas, a menagerie of obsolete and repurposed aircraft, each one a flying bomb piloted by a boy who has already said his goodbyes. From the deck of a destroyer on the picket line, the experience is pure, unadulterated hell. The general quarters alarm is a constant, screaming backdrop to the roar of your own 5-inch guns firing until their barrels glow red. You see a Zero coming in low, skimming the waves. Every gun on your side of the ship turns to face it. The water around the plane is churned into a white froth by thousands of machine gun bullets. You can see pieces flying off the plane, trailing smoke, but it keeps coming, relentlessly. It doesn't jink, it doesn't weave. It just gets bigger and bigger in your field of vision until it fills your entire world. The destroyer USS Aaron Ward is hit by 6 kamikazes in under an hour and is left a burning, sinking wreck. The USS Laffey, in a fight that will become legendary, is hit by 4 bombs and struck by 6 kamikazes, but by some miracle, her crew keeps her afloat. All around the fleet, the story is the same. Ships are burning. Men are dying. The air is thick with the smell of burning oil, cordite, and charred human flesh. The comfortable, detached logic of the command center has been replaced by the brutal, bloody arithmetic of the picket line. In Pearl Harbor, Leighton and his team were forced to listen to this catastrophe unfold over the radio, their Cassandra-like prophecies coming true in the most horrific way imaginable. The truth they had uncovered was no longer an abstract concept in a classified file. It was being written in the wreckage of American ships and the lives of American sailors. The system had pushed back, and this was the price of that denial. The crushing weight of their failure wasn't just professional, it was personal. Every frantic report of another ship hit, every casualty list that would soon be typed up, was a testament to the truth that had been willingly ignored. The fog of war had lifted for them, but their superiors had chosen to keep their eyes squeezed shut. Sound of a gentle breeze, birdsong, the quiet footsteps of an old man on a gravel path jump forward in time. Decades have passed. The roar of the guns over Okinawa has faded into the silence of history. The great steel ships have been turned to scrap or rest as silent, coral-encrusted memorials on the ocean floor. It is the late 1970s. We are in a quiet garden in Honolulu. An old man, his back slightly stooped, his hair a shock of white, is carefully tending to his roses. His hands, though wrinkled, are steady. This is Edwin T. Leighton, retired Rear Admiral, the man who was once the fleet intelligence officer for the entire Pacific Fleet. The man who tried to warn them. For 30 years, the files remained sealed. The full story of what naval intelligence knew about the Kamikaze program, its origins, its cynical nature, its true scale was locked away under the stamp of top secret. The official history, the one taught to cadets and written in popular books, held to the familiar, simpler narrative the Kamikaze was the ultimate, shocking expression of the Japanese warrior spirit, a terrifying surprise that the brave boys of the U.S. Navy met with courage and steel. It was a good story. It was a heroic story. But it wasn't the whole truth. Then, in the 1970s, under a new wave of declassification initiatives, the archives began to open. Historians, researchers, and veterans who had long nursed unanswered questions began to dig. They found Layton's reports. They found the interrogations of prisoners of war. They found the captured diaries, the signals intercepts, the chillingly accurate predictions of the Kikisui attacks. It was all there, in black and white, preserved on dry, yellowing paper. The truth, buried for a generation, was finally coming to light. Imagine a young historian sitting in the hushed quiet of the National Archives. He's been scrolling through endless reels of microfilm, his eyes burning. And then he finds it. A memo, dated February 1945, from Layton's office to the senior staff of Admiral Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet. The memo contains a detailed analysis of the special attack units, warning that Japan has conserved thousands of aircraft for suicide missions and will deploy them in coordinated mass attacks against the fleet at Okinawa. It predicts the tactics, the feints, the low-level approaches with unnerving accuracy. It is a ghost crying out from the past. The historian leans back in his chair, the silence of the archive suddenly feeling heavy, profound. He is holding the smoking gun. He is holding the proof that the catastrophe at Okinawa was not just a tragedy, but an avoidable one. Layton himself, in his final years, would finally tell his story. He wrote a memoir, And I Was There, a title laden with the quiet frustration of a man who saw the iceberg but couldn't convince the captain to turn the wheel. He described the pushback, the preference for comfortable myths over hard intelligence. He recounted the agonizing days of the Okinawa campaign, knowing that the information that could have saved lives and ships was sitting in a locked file. This declassified truth did not rewrite the history of the battle's outcome, but it fundamentally changed our understanding of it. It vindicated the tireless, often thankless work of the intelligence officers. It proved they had done their job with brilliant success. They had stripped the Kamikaze of its mythological power and exposed it for what it was, the last, convulsive act of a dying regime. They had lifted the fog of war, only to have a curtain of bureaucratic denial drawn in their faces. The declassified files were more than just historical documents. They were an apology, written 30 years too late, to the men who had seen the truth but were condemned not to be heard. And they laid the groundwork for the final, awe-inspiring revelation of what the Kamikaze truly represented. Sound starts with the quiet rustle of old paper, then slowly fades into a respectful silence, punctuated by a single, resonant note like a temple bell. So now, here in the quiet of the archive, with all the declassified files spread before us, the fog has finally lifted. The entire, sprawling investigation, from the deck of the sinking St. Lo, to the pilot's poetic diary, to the interrogation of a shipwrecked mechanic, to the ignored warnings in a flag officer's briefing room, it all clicks into place. Every confusing report, every heroic sacrifice, every tragic mistake aligns into one coherent and profoundly human picture. And in that clarity, we arrive at the aha moment, the ultimate truth of the Kamikaze. The divine wind was not a weapon. Not really. It was a message. Think of it this way. Imagine you are playing a game of poker against a player with an infinite stack of chips. You can't outbet him. You can't bluff him. You know, with absolute mathematical certainty, that you will eventually lose. This was the position of Japan's high command in late 1944. They knew the war was lost on every conventional metric. So, they did the only thing they could. They changed the game. They weren't trying to win the pot anymore. They were trying to make the price of staying at the table so psychologically horrifying that the other player would simply fold and walk away. Every kamikaze that dove into the deck of an American ship was a vote. It was a message, written in blood and fire, addressed directly to the mothers, fathers, and politicians back in the United States. The message was this: you can defeat our armies. You can sink our fleets. You can burn our cities. But to get to our homeland, you will have to kill every single one of us, one by one. Each of your victories will come at a cost of blood and grief that your comfortable society will not be able to bear. This is how we will fight. Are you prepared to pay that price? This is the beautiful, terrible idea that explains everything. It explains why they used rookie pilots, because they weren't meant to be skilled aviators, they were meant to be martyrs. It explains the cynical use of the cherry blossom symbolism to provide a spiritual justification for a cold, political calculation. It explains the sheer scale of the attacks at Okinawa. It was a final, horrifying demonstration of intent before the planned invasion of the mainland. The kamikaze was the ultimate form of psychological warfare. It turned Japan's greatest weakness, its lack of resources, into its most terrifying strength, its willingness to accept national suicide. And here is the final, chilling echo of this story. The message was received. The brutal fighting on Okinawa and the apocalyptic vision of the kamikaze attacks had a profound effect on American leadership. The estimated casualty figures for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, were astronomical, running into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million. The image of a sky filled with thousands of suicide planes, of beaches defended by every man, woman, and child, gave these estimates a terrifying credibility. And so, the kamikaze, this desperate gamble born from the certainty of Japan's defeat, became a key, unspoken justification for the decision to use another, even more terrible weapon. The men who made the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did so, in their minds, by weighing one horror against another. They chose the certainty of 200,000 dead in 2 cities against the possibility of 1 million dead in a prolonged, island-wide battle of annihilation. The story of the kamikaze, therefore, is not just a military investigation. It is a human tragedy of the highest order. It is a story about how a nation, in its death throes, created a weapon so psychologically potent that it helped convince its conquerors to unleash the very power of the sun to end the war. The divine wind did not save Japan from defeat, but in a final, terrifying irony, it may have saved it from annihilation by inviting a different kind of apocalypse. It is the ultimate testament to the fog of war, where the only thing more terrifying than misunderstanding your enemy is understanding him completely and being forced to act on that terrible truth.